I am so very, very pleased and really proud to welcome Megan Kassabaum to the Marco Island Historical Society Zoom-in series. This series has been our channel to stay very connected to everyone who is passionate about our history. And so I thank them for that. And Meg, I thank you. Meg is assistant professor of anthropology and director of the Center for Ancient Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She is a Weingarten assistant curator for North America at the Penn Museum, and she's a specialist in the archaeology of the American South. So she will be speaking with us today about teaching with collections at the Penn Museum, Key Marco and beyond. So we are all very, very excited to hear your talk, Meg. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. This is exciting. I was saying earlier, I really wish I could be doing this from Florida. It would be much nicer. And I'm really excited to get to come down and visit the museum there sometime soon. But for now, I'm excited to get to share with you some of the work we've been doing at Penn with the collections that come from that very special place in Florida. So I think what I'll do now is I will share my screen and go through a little bit of a PowerPoint just to give you a sense of some of the things that we're doing at the Penn Museum. And while I'm speaking, you're welcome to add anything into the Q&A if you have questions. I will not really be able to see it until the end of the talk. And so, don't expect me to answer right away, but I will check that at the end and try and go through any questions. And then of course you can add those questions at the end as well while we're sort of going through the first couple questions that were asked. So feel free to type those in. And I'm gonna share my screen now if that's good for you, Patricia. Okay.
Perfect.
All right, now hopefully everyone can see that. Yep, okay, cool. Okay, so as Patricia said, I am a professor in the anthropology department at the University of Pennsylvania, and then also a curator in our museum, which is an archaeology and anthropology museum. And really what that means is I kind of have to walk the line between being an academic and a scholar, and then thinking about how to best teach this material as well as to present it to the public. And so I'm going to take you through a number of different things today that we're doing to use the collections that we have at the Penn Museum. And I'm going to focus mostly on the Key Marco collections, just to sort of give you a sense of what we're trying to do. All right, so let's get started here. So during the presentation today, I'm going to talk about three main things. And I should note that all three of these things stem from the sort of sense of disbelief that I had when I first came to the Penn Museum as a curator and went to see the Key Marco materials for the first time. I'm an archaeologist who works in the American South, mostly in the lower Mississippi River Valley, where materials like those from the Marco Island area just do not preserve. We don't have things that look like this on most sites. And so when I saw the Key Marco collection, I was just blown away and I was inspired to try and use it in all sorts of different ways. So I'm going to talk about three of those ways today. The first, and probably what you would most expect from a museum, I'm going to talk about how we use these objects in our galleries. I'm going to talk about two galleries in particular. Then I will sort of shift our focus to discuss some of our virtual programs, which of course have become particularly important recently, thanks to the COVID situation. And then I'll probably try and spend most of our time talking about how we use these objects in classes. And during this, I'll be talking about three particular spaces in the museum that we use for these purposes. So this is our beautiful museum. This is what it looks like here in the spring. I guarantee you it's still chilly and colder here than it is in Florida. So to get us started, I want to start with galleries. And overall, of course, the goal of our galleries, much like the goal of the exhibit that you all have on display there, is to highlight Eastern North American native sites, peoples, and objects. And I think one of the primary goals that I have as a curator here at Penn is to put those sites, peoples, and objects into these broader world historical narratives that we try and display in our museum. So we've got galleries dedicated to every continent and to all the major regions. And one of my goals as a North American curator is to make sure that Native North Americans have their place in these stories as well. So the first gallery that I want to talk about is a recent gallery that has made pretty heavy use of the Key Marco materials. This is a gallery called Native American Voices. And in this gallery, visitors can see over 200 objects from the North American collections here. And the general goal of the exhibit is to challenge common Native American stereotypes, particularly the one that the archaeological cultures that are studied by archaeologists that work at our museum pretty much cease to exist, and instead to emphasize the present voices of Native American people. So we use both old and contemporary Native American objects. We use video and audio recordings, and we have all sorts of digital interactive opportunities that allow visitors to develop a new understanding of the original inhabitants of the land that most of our visitors live on today. So the most important role of the key Marco materials here is to remind people of what is usually not there archaeologically. So as you look at the archaeological objects in this gallery, you're mostly seeing stone and ceramic objects, and the key Marco materials like this beautiful bird figurehead here allow us to emphasize that often the materials that are the most remarkable on sites, things that are made of wood or other organic materials, don't preserve. So we put these objects on display in that gallery specifically to emphasize the importance of looking beyond the ceramic and the stone materials that archaeologists so commonly focus on. The second gallery that I want to mention is one that I curated recently called Mound Builders, Ancient Architects of North America. And the point of this exhibit was to remind visitors who might be very familiar with some of the more famous monuments around the globe, so things like the pyramids in Egypt, Stonehenge in England, Machu Picchu in Peru, that we actually have our own really impressive monuments right here in the United States, made out of earth and shell. And so with this exhibit, we were trying to sort of explore that fascinating 7,500-year history of Native American mound building that's right here in the Eastern United States. And we used, as you can see in this picture, photographs, artifacts, archival materials, and excavation records. So in terms of the role that Key Marco played in this exhibit, there were really two important things. One of them is we created this map of sites that were publicly accessible, sites that people could go and visit themselves to get a sense of what these locations actually looked like. We also, of course, marked all of the places that objects from the exhibit were found at. But this was one place where we drew not only on Key Marco, but on a number of other sites in Florida that, it's important to remind people that these places still exist, that you can go to these places, that you can go to the local museums nearby and learn even more about these sites. But perhaps more importantly, we also used objects from Key Marco. And in particular, we use these materials to talk about Mississippian Native belief systems. So in the case that we put together featuring the Key Marco materials, we highlighted that many of the objects that were made particularly out of shell and bone at the site depict various artistic motifs that represent signs and symbols shared among a wide variety of groups that archaeologists now refer to as the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. So we focus specifically on an example of a shell gorget, this object over here, which was found at the Key Marco site, that shows a cross motif. And we talk a little bit about how that cross motif would have actually been a center symbol, a representation of the center of the world. We're going to come back to this object a little bit later in this talk, but I also wanted to point out this cool object on the far side here. This is a rattlesnake tail, probably a carved bone piece, and it's a really beautiful piece. And again, rattlesnakes are something that we can utilize to sort of explore and think about the belief systems and the types of supernatural beings that Native people, like the folks that lived at Key Marco before European contact, utilized. I'll also point out really quickly, this little object here is another one from Key Marco, and I'll talk a little bit more about that object in just a little while. So that particular case provides a pretty good transition into my second main topic, particularly because that was a place in this exhibit that I curated where we just didn't have the space to get into nearly as much detail as I wanted to get into. And for any of you who have done any exhibit design, you're probably very aware of this problem. There's always a much more complex and interesting story to tell than you have space for. So for that reason, sort of this provides us these sorts of moments provide us great opportunities to offer additional information to our audiences beyond what's in the galleries through the use of things like virtual programs. So as I mentioned earlier, the use of virtual programs was already underway, but became particularly important during COVID times. So the broad purpose is to expand on these complicated stories that exist behind the objects that we show in galleries. But it became really clear to me when I started doing these virtual programs during COVID times that this was also a way to reach a much broader audience, perhaps an audience that couldn't come visit us in Philadelphia or that otherwise wouldn't have access to these objects and these stories. So this became really, really important. And I want to talk about very briefly about two different examples. So during normal times here at the Penn Museum, we do something called the Daily Dig, which is where we invite speakers that know a lot about a particular object in our galleries to present about a 10-minute live gallery talk where we tell the stories that we either didn't have the space or the ability to tell in a gallery. These were a lot of fun as someone who got to do them, and I know our visitors really enjoyed them. So when we were forced to close thanks to COVID, we figured out a way to offer them online. So that means that every day we offer basically a 3-minute exploration of some sort of extraordinary artifact that allows our virtual visitors to gain deeper insights into its history, its cultural context, its caretaking, or whatever else the speaker wants to talk about. Importantly, these little mini talks also allow our visitors to hear the unique perspectives of the archaeologists, anthropologists, conservators, archivists, or other museum specialists that are doing the talk. So an example of one of these that has used the Key Marco collection is a digital daily dig that I did called the Mississippian Cosmos. And again, this was something we were trying to get into in that case in the exhibit, but just didn't have the space to include these graphics and to tell these stories. So here we're looking at that same gorget again with that cross-shaped motif. And you can actually see up in the top sort of right-hand corner of the slide that here's where I was able to sort of highlight what that cross-shaped motif means to Mississippian people and to connect it to the broader view of the cosmos. So to connect it to the common Native American belief that the world is made up of multiple layers, that those layers are inhabited by various supernatural beings, and that we have means as humans to interact with those by traveling along a sort of central axis or an axis mundi and sort of moving back and forth between these worlds. So of course, in doing this, I didn't just use objects from Key Marco, but I put the Key Marco objects like this gorget into conversation with objects from other areas. This little guy right here is one of my favorites. He's from the Feltus site in southwestern Mississippi and is likely a representation of the underwater panther, or this little creature in the bottom right that's highlighted in yellow, or sorry, in orange here, as a resident of the underworld. So this is one way where I was able to sort of take this story that I know well as an archaeologist and try and encapsulate it into 3 minutes to teach the audience a little bit more about one of these objects that we have on display, but can never give enough time to. Just briefly, another type of virtual program that we've run is what we are calling living room lectures. These are once a month Thursday lectures with various staff from the museum, allowing us to delve not just into more detail, but often into a more informal context and talk to our visitors as close to face as we can get during COVID times. So people are watching live through Facebook, they can ask us questions live. Those questions are then posed to us by the moderator, and we're able to really get into conversations with people. And this is one of the places where I was really able to judge just how interested the Penn Museum's audience is with sites like Key Marco. I mentioned some of the objects from the Key Marco site in my lecture on mound building in North America and immediately got tons and tons of questions. Then a couple of weeks later, my colleague Lucy Fowler-Williams, who was doing another living room lecture on amplifying Native American perspectives in the collections, was asked about some of those Key Marco objects. So it shows that people are really engaging with these virtual programs and allowing us to talk about these objects even when we can't show them. Okay, so this brings us to classes where I want to spend the majority of our time today. This is obviously particularly important to me because as a teacher, it allows me to provide students with hands-on experience working with objects, which stimulates their excitement and their interest about the field of archaeology. And then it also allows me to provide them with experience of conducting independent research. And I'm going to give you a few examples of this. So to start off with the most basic stuff, as soon as I began teaching archaeology at Penn, I immediately recognized the value of the key marco materials for teaching about archaeological preservation. So in almost every archaeology class that you can find, whether at Penn or at any other university, you have to deal with the question of why we find what we find and what impact that process of preservation actually has on how we as archaeologists can go about making our interpretations of what we find. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of this, key marco serves as basically an amazing reminder of what we're missing at many traditional archaeological sites because so many of the materials were not preserved. So in general, no matter where you are, whether you're in a museum context or classroom context, it's relatively easy to show students examples of materials that are preserved through what I would refer to as standard preservation materials. So just things that are going to preserve buried in the ground for a long period of time. Most people have at least a small teaching collection of stone spear points or arrow points. Most people have broken pottery. You can show these sorts of things to students and talk to them about artifacts, but it's much more rare for students to really get to engage with materials that are preserved through these less common preservation methods. So I, of course, use the key marco objects to teach about things preserved through the process of waterlogging. So basically materials that were unable to break down because they weren't getting the oxygen necessary to sort of see the preservation or the decomposition process get started. And so these materials show up in the key marco collection and in a number of other places. And often prior to arriving at Penn, what I would do is put up a slide like the one that you can see here that shows, say, the excavation of a dugout canoe and gives people a sense of what these objects look like. However, in addition to sort of being able to see it on a PowerPoint slide, it can mean a lot for the student to actually get to engage with one of these objects that's preserved through waterlogging. And the key marco objects in particular provide great examples of both how that process occurs and what actually needs to happen after excavation to protect and maintain the integrity of these sorts of objects. So just to show you one example, in class, we look at both the objects themselves. So these are two objects on either side of the slide here that came from the key marco site. And then we also look at watercolors that Wells Sawyer painted of them when they were first revealed during the excavation. And that's what's depicted here in the center. And what's so important about being able to do this is that it allows me to teach my students about the types of deterioration we can see in both pigments, which is what the bird figurehead here on the left is showing. You can see that at one time, this was a beautifully painted figurehead. Some of those pigments are still visible, but they are gradually wearing away. And then also as in terms of what happens to wood when it is removed from the preservation situation it was in, where it was fully waterlogged, which generally leads to warping. So we'll come back to these topics a little bit later in this talk, but I wanted to show you these examples now and just let you know that my experience with teaching with these objects has been that by seeing the objects in person rather than just seeing images on a PowerPoint slide, which believe me, I wish I could be showing you all these objects in person as well, but there are some great examples that you can see in the exhibit down there. But I really found that my students were able to connect with these objects in a much deeper way. And this was really clearly demonstrated by the types of questions that they asked and about the details of the archaeological context that they were found in, the details about the processes that were used to create them, and the detailed questions about the cultures who utilized them. Another side benefit of this is it allowed me to demonstrate some of the skills necessary for the students to engage in, for this class, what was their final project, which was an object profile. And I want to talk a little bit about how we allow students to actually engage with these sorts of materials in a more hands-on way. So this basically brings up the question of how we manage to do this sort of hands-on learning, even with accessioned museum objects that are exceptionally rare and exceptionally fragile. And I think it's important to note here that really what this involves is an incredible amount of infrastructure, both in terms of spaces and in terms of people or staffing. So I want to start with the discussion of two spaces and their staff members. One of these is the collection study room, which you can see on the left here. Really importantly, this is a pretty simple space, but it is staffed with people who have not at all simple jobs. These people go and pull objects from the collection storage for students to use. They're there to help students actually analyze the materials and work with them, to watch over them, to make sure that no damage is occurring, to answer questions, etc. And then the second space I want to talk about is the Center for the Analysis of Archaeological Materials. And again, I want to highlight the role of the staff there, which consists of professional museum collections managers, as well as instructors that are specifically hired to do this sort of hands-on teaching. So we'll look at a couple of examples of classes that have used these spaces now. So here's a class taking place in the collection study room. And this is a pretty typical example of what a class might look like, especially if an instructor has not used the collection study room a ton. And if they're not dedicating a massive amount of time in their class to the study of materials, because this is basically, we had collection staff come pull a bunch of objects that were of interest to the class. And then the instructor sort of stands with the students where they can closely examine the materials and talks them through what they want them to recognize. So this is basically a see but don't touch type of class. And this works really well for a lot of purposes. Obviously, if you want to use objects in, say, 1 or 2 class periods over the course of the semester, you can easily schedule this in the collection study room, and your students can get a sense of what it's like to stand in the room with some of these amazing materials. They can examine them really closely. They can perhaps even photograph them for class projects. But if you need your students to be able to touch, which obviously some classes would in terms of allowing them to really engage with the objects in a meaningful way, then you can ask that your students go through formal object handling training, which is done, it's basically conducted with members of our conservation department in the museum. And this is really incredible because these students learn in the process of being trained to handle the objects, not just about how amazing the objects are, but also all of the careful techniques that museum professionals know pretty well about moving objects, how you can handle them, how you should hold them, how to balance their weight, how to make sure they're well supported, etc. And this is really important for closer examination of objects, but also especially if you want your students to go on and do an independent work with an object. And this is kind of where I've done some assignments that have become really close to my heart in terms of getting students engaged with archaeology and Native North America. So as an example of one of these, I know you probably can't read all of the detail here and you certainly don't need to, but this is an example of an object profile assignment that I did in my Archaeology of Native North America class. This course, the broad goal of it was to explore over 10,000 years of the North American archaeological record. And we were trying to investigate those unwritten histories and material evidence of indigenous peoples that lived in this continent prior to European contact. So for their object profile, each student chose one object from the American section collections and spent a week studying it in that collection study room that I was just showing you. So in their papers, they reported on what they learned from basically observing and handling the object in the lab. And my goal was to encourage their really, really deep involvement of the object by asking them to do things like examine it from all angles, to measure it, to photograph it, to draw it by hand, etc. And one student commented in the process of doing this object profile that she found handling the piece to be extremely useful because it allowed for the examination of small details in a way that viewing images never would have. And she said that eventually these small details became the most fascinating aspect of the piece. And that's certainly the case for this little rectangular object that I have up on the slide right now. So one of my students did her project on this object from Key Marco, and when she started, it was recorded in our catalog simply as a sea tortoise shell plate. So she sat down with the object, she studied it pretty thoroughly over the course of about a week, being in the collection study room every day. And at the end, her analysis actually allowed us to update our records to say that this piece was a net gauge and that it was made from turtle plastron, not turtle shell. So her research basically showed that weavers would have created uniform size holes in their nets by tying knots around this little rectangle. And then she got into a really detailed discussion of the decoration. This has always been discussed as dolphins. And one of the things that she talked about was the position of the fins at various places on these fish, and argued that perhaps they don't represent dolphins. She also talked about the lines across the mouth on one fish as being related to native methods of representing a deceased creature rather than a live creature. So basically, she drew on both archaeological and ethnographic analogies, as well as on data from marine biology, in order to talk about what this thing was, what it might have meant, what it was made out of, and how it might have been used. So in her words, she said that her research revealed not only the history of the object, but it also hinted at how Key Marco fit into the natural and human worlds of the late prehistoric Americas. So as a teacher, it was really fun and wonderful for me to get to see her work with this object in such detail. And immediately I started thinking about what other Key Marco objects would make for good object profiles. And these are the two objects that I've selected to put on my future list of objects that would make for a good object profile. The one on the left, I put on there specifically because there have been some debates about its authenticity. And some of those have to do with the fact that we don't actually know what sort of pigment could have been used like this that should have preserved so well on the inside of the shell. So a student might be able to undertake various testing methods to actually determine what this pigment is, to determine its age and when it might have been applied. Likewise, the gorget, the other one that's back up on the screen for the third time. I think that this one could be really fun for a student to engage with, in the sense that they could tie it to that broader corpus of Southeastern ceremonial complex materials. They could also talk about shell species. They could talk about the carving methods that were used. We've got a lot of detailed machinery that would allow them to see the carving marks really, really up close under high magnification, and talk about the types of tools that might have been used to make an object like this. So I want to give you one more example of an object profile, this time from our Anthropology of Museums class. So for this object profile, students examine Native American objects from our American section by combining material analysis, so things like identifying elements, construction, design, condition, etc., and also adding in documentation, so things like text, photographs, ethnographic data, etc. And to write their final reports, students were asked to seek out similar materials, to consult research articles and archives, and then also to consider non-material evidence, so things like oral tradition, knowledge about the ecosystem that the object came from, memories of various museum staff and how the object had been used, etc., that might illuminate these objects and their histories. So one of my very favorite students took on the study of the Key Marco deer figurehead that's shown here. And she determined that the really delicate physique of the small figurehead, as well as some of the ways that it is specifically depicted, probably means that it represents the endangered Florida key deer, which is the smallest subspecies of North American white-tailed deer that was once abundant on those lower Florida keys, but is now a highly endangered species. So from there, she went on to draw on the ethnographic records of the Calusa and argued that the object was basically one left trace of the rich ceremonial complex that showed how connected the Calusa and the Key Marco people were to their surrounding environment, and sort of centered the discussion on just how dynamic and lush the natural environment of the region was. So again, a really wonderful example. I'm not going to go into the details, but she also did a ton of detailed analysis of these pigments and tried to talk about what this object would have originally looked like if all of that paint had still been there. So a few times now, I've mentioned some of the detailed analyses that students have, or we hope students are able to do. And the reason that they're able to do this is due to the existence of something at the Penn Museum called the Center for the Analysis of Archaeological Materials. I'll call it CAM for short because it's a real mouthful. But this opened when I first arrived at Penn as an endeavor between the Penn Museum and the School of Arts and Sciences at Penn. And the goal was to offer the facilities, materials, equipment, and personnel to teach and mentor Penn students in a broad range of scientific techniques that are crucial to archaeology. So our mission when we started CAM was to introduce and train both undergraduate and graduate students in these analytic techniques. to foster and mentor their research projects, and to support Penn research more broadly, particularly fieldwork and then associated analysis, by training students in the collection and analysis of specimens. So the laboratories at CAM are really amazing, and I would invite any of you, if you come up to Philadelphia, to get in touch with me, and I would be happy to give you a tour. But they allow us to do everything from sample preparation, examination, and analysis. We have a human skeletal laboratory, a ceramics laboratory that's dedicated to thin section petrography, so looking at the microstructure within ceramics. We have a multi-purpose laboratory. We have a general purpose wet laboratory. We have a special zooarchaeology laboratory. That's where a lot of the analysis of these animal remains that we've been talking about came from. And then we have a classroom that has basically the ability to teach up to 25 students on this high-powered digital microscope that you can see one of my colleagues using here. Importantly, these laboratories also have these extensive teaching and reference collections. So things like turtle shell and turtle plastron that helped my student decide which part of the turtle that little net gauge was made out of, and specimens of different types of deer that allowed my other student to kind of compare the different specimens to the skulls of deer. Again, I think it's really important to note the necessity of the center being staffed by teaching specialists who are really impressive experts in one or more of the areas that CAM covers. So everything from ceramics to digital archaeology, from archaeobotany to skeletal analysis, and from lithics to archaeometallurgy and conservation. So our students are really able to get a lot of hands-on experience through CAM. And again, I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the places that Key Marco entered into this discussion. So one of the final assignments in a graduate course about in the CAM program was to design a research proposal using materials that were available to them here in the Penn Museum, basically to encourage students to think through what we can learn from archaeological objects that are already in collections, rather than always focusing on going out into the field and digging more. So in this particular case, my student Autumn, who you can see pictured here in the Penn Museum archives, basically proposed to examine 4 masks that were uncovered from Key Marco via both infrared photography and statistical analysis. And her goal was basically to determine which of the wooden masks we have match up with which of those original Wells Sawyer archival documents that we have. And then also to address how warped each of these masks were as basically an example to help us understand archaeological preservation better. So 2 figures from her proposal are represented here. So on the left side, you can see the incredible watercolors that were made as soon as these objects were excavated from the site. And then on the right, you can see a photograph of how that object looks now. So in some cases, we were able to match these objects up with their associated watercolor. And I think the best example here is to show this sort of little black pie slice of paint here still shows up on the archaeological object here. So she was able to match these up. There are other masks in our collection that couldn't be matched to the image because nothing was quite diagnostic enough. So her proposal was written to use infrared photography to get those different pigment colors to show up a little bit more and maybe allow her to match up the unknown masks. And then the part of the assignment that I thought was actually the most interesting was to basically give us an assessment of how different species of wood works under different conditions. So she wanted to do some really detailed statistical analyses of shrinkage in these masks. Did they shrink more vertically or horizontally? When they warped and twisted, did they twist with the grain or against the grain? And this was really going to help us understand not just these particular objects, but also sort of archaeological preservation more broadly. So just to sort of wrap up, this brings us, of course, to the idea that there are a number of different spaces that I didn't give a lot of attention to in this presentation. And one of them is the archives, to emphasize the importance of the records that were kept during the excavation of the Key Marco site, in addition to the objects that were brought back to our museum. And then just to talk very briefly about a couple of sort of final future, I guess I should say, future projects. This is the front page from an article that I just wrote with Austin Bell, the curator down there at the Marco Island Museum. And we wrote this basically to spur our own excitement about how we might collaborate to better understand these collections. And in the article, we emphasize the importance of not just looking at all those incredible iconographic objects like the figureheads that I've shown today, but also to really learn about the everyday utilitarian objects that are at the site. In addition, this gave us the chance to reflect on exactly the topic that I was talking about today. This gave us the chance to reflect on how these things can be used for both public education and in coursework. So you can see up here, we've got a little discussion of precisely the case study that I just gave you. And then the next future direction that I wanted to mention, with the permission of Diana, who's actually on this call, is once this once this talk got advertised, I got an email from Diana Hutchinson, a archaeology graduate student at Florida Atlantic University, to let me know that as part of her graduate internship with the Florida Public Archaeology Network, she was creating a virtual learning center using Google Slides to showcase some of the really amazing objects from South Florida. And so she sent me this as kind of a preview. This isn't yet publicly available, but by clicking on these objects, it was really fun to see that this actually allowed people to link back to the Penn Museum and to our online collections and to explore this collection in more detail. So I'm really excited to see what she does with this yet, and then sort of how we might collaborate to get even more detail about these objects, perhaps even some of the detail that is being uncovered by our student projects onto websites like this and available to a much broader audience. So I think with that very quick overview of the types of stuff we're doing at the Penn Museum, I am going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to take a look at the question and answer here. So while I look at that, if anyone has questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A or type them into the chat, and I'll try and keep my eye on both. But I would love to know what you'd like to know a little bit more about. So I see one question here from Karen Madigan, which says, when students discover alternate or additional details of a piece, what is the process of changing the original information on record? This is a great question. So it depends a little bit on whether that object is from the American section where I'm a curator or whether it's from a different section. So I have access to changing the record. So if I have worked with that student throughout the entirety of the semester, I'm confident in their interpretations. You know, I've looked at their research, their citations, their sources. I can go through the process and actually change that myself on our digital record. What I do when I do that, and I think this is important, is I actually cite back to the class in which that research took place. That provides the date, the name of the student, and I upload a PDF of whatever their final project was. I do this for a couple of reasons. One is to document the importance of student research and to make sure that sort of when we look at these things down the road, we know that one of the reasons we know these incredible things about these objects is because we let them be utilized in classes. Another reason that I do that is that it does give that little caveat that this was based on student research, and it allows people to go back if they need to and look at what the original record was. So I never delete anything, I just make an update to it and move whatever now outdated information there is into sort of a notes field. So, you know, as a curator at the museum, that's something I'm able to do. There's a lot of this type of research that happens in classes where a curator is not teaching them, where say someone from the Spanish department is teaching them, or someone from Native American and Indigenous Studies is teaching them. And if that's the case, they would need to reach out to either a curator or a keeper, which is kind of like a collections manager here, to make that update. And again, they would follow the same procedure. They would keep everything really detailed. They would add notes about sort of why the change was made. They would make sure to maintain all of the past information, et cetera. So yeah, that's a really wonderful question, and certainly something that we have to consider carefully in terms of like trusting these students' research. If someone just sent us a quick opinion, it probably wouldn't make it in there. Your question, let's see, I see another question here about whether the current photos of the Marco masks are available through the Penn website as well as the Sawyer drawings. So we do have pictures of the Key Marco objects on our website through our online collections portal. Some of them have really, really, really nice photography. Those tend to be the ones that have been on display. When something goes on display or when it goes on loan, it's photographed by our photo studio. Sometimes they're not as formal photographs if they've never gone on display, or at least not anytime recently. We might only have older photos up there. Sadly, at this time, our archival collections have not yet been updated online, though many of the Sawyer's drawings you can find through various other sources. The Smithsonian has some up. Some of them have been published recently in the Archaeological Conservancy's magazine and American Archaeology magazine. So there are a few ways to get it, but I'm hoping that we can get some of that material up. This brings up a really interesting question as well, which is sort of how student research can be shared with the public. A lot of those records that I'm talking about are internal records to the museum, and you'd have to submit a research request to see the details. But your question about this reminds me to mention the Penn Museum blog is one of the places where this type of research is often focused on. And that's actually one of the places where you are able to see some of these more informal illustrations, including some of the drawings and photographs that students have taken, because that allows us to publish something in a more informal way and to not officially associate it with the object record. Let's see, then I also see in the chat, there's a question from Jory Westbury. Is it possible for a museum to use a virtual interactive information design and send it out to schools before students came for a field trip? So this is a really great question, and I'll tell you a little bit about how we handle this at the Penn Museum. Though it is certainly, I think this is a great idea to sort of expand on. I think more and more museums will have the capacity to do this after COVID, because we've spent so much time thinking through virtual interactives. So at the Penn Museum, we run a program that's called Unpacking the Past. And this is a program by which we invite all 7th grade students in the Philadelphia Public School District to come to the museum. And prior to their field trip, we work with their teachers to provide a pre-visit lesson that tries to give the background information they're going to need to actually understand their visit. And then they also get a post-visit sort of presentation from a museum staff member that helps them unpack some of the things that they've seen. Now, we used to do this in person. We would send a staff member out to the school. They would bring materials with them. They would do an interactive lesson right there. But we as a museum reopened before the Philadelphia Public Schools reopened, which means that, you know, people could come and do field trips, but we weren't able to go into their classrooms. And so we had to switch some of this over to virtual means. So I think at this point, I would say at our museum, it's absolutely possible for a museum to use virtual interactive information to sort of get a school set up and ready for a field trip. I will say that we are a big museum and we have a lot of funding from the university. And I think this is something that might be much more difficult to do on a really small scale because it does take a lot of effort on the part of the staff. But I'll be really curious to see sort of where this Florida interactive exhibit that's being developed by the Florida Public Archaeology Network is going to go, because that seems like it might be able to be utilized not just for, say, one, like the Florida Museum of Natural History, but even for smaller museums like the one that you all have there on Marco Island. So I think that's definitely a direction that we should be going. Another important thing to mention with respect to that is we run a program called the International Classroom that allows us to basically provide virtual field trips to students that are unable to come to the Penn Museum. And the idea behind this was to reach international audiences. This was something that is really important to me because I think often international audiences are not exposed to Native American archaeology at all. But in the end, it's been just as useful to reach various school kids within the United States that can't come for some reason, whether that's due to funding in their school district and being able to get, you know, the bus, et cetera, for a field trip, or for students with disabilities that aren't able to come in or aren't able to read labels, or our deaf communities that aren't able to hear during these sorts of talks. So there's a lot of functionality in our international classroom that also emphasizes domestic students. And I think that's really important to do as well. So again, I would encourage other museums to do it, but I also recognize the privilege that we have at Penn to sort of have the ability to have these spaces to record these things and to have the staff to actually do it. Let's see. Yeah, so okay, Charlotte McLaughlin asked, could she access the daily digs to see more of them? Yes, absolutely. So the daily digs are available on the Penn Museum website. And while I'm talking, I will try and look up a link to it and put it in the chat to all of you. But yeah, so a lot of the materials that are available on our website, if you search Penn Museum at home, those objects that we discuss in the daily digs, as well as all sorts of other materials, are available there. We have anthropology at home activities where students can learn and get hands-on with stuff they have in their own houses. We do things like have them sort buttons or sort their cutlery drawers to sort of learn about archaeological sorting. We've got things where they learn how to build various types of structures that were used in the past. So there's a lot of really great materials up on our website, and one of the things that you'll find there is the links to the daily digs. So I just got it. Let me try and change the chat. See if I can use it to everyone. I don't know that I can. Yeah, I'm not sure I have any way to send anything to all of the attendees. But what I will say is, if you just search Penn Museum at home, it comes up, and the fourth link that you'll see says Digital Daily Digs. You can view the playlist there and you can see all of them. You can sort by area. So if you're only interested in North America, you can look at that. But there's a lot of really fascinating things out there. So we would love it if they get shared and used broadly. Teachers are welcome to use them in class, etc. There's also some virtual gallery tours on there that people can use. This is one of the things that I have to say has been the best about COVID. It's obviously been really hard and really a bad thing across the board, but it did cause us to make a lot of our information more accessible. And hopefully that means you don't have to be in Philadelphia to interact with our collections anymore. Let's see. Oh yeah. So someone asked, they have the two books written by Gilliland on Key Marco's archaeological pieces, and can I recommend any other publications? So for a long time, those two Gilliland books were kind of all that was out there. But I can happily say now that Austin Bell has a book out through the University of Florida Press. I know that it is accessible on their website, but I'm sure you can also buy it right there at the museum. And I imagine you can find it on Amazon. I have yet to read all of it. I ordered it, but Florida Press hasn't sent it to me. But I've talked to him a lot about it, and you would learn a great deal, particularly about the Key Marco cat from reading his book. So I would definitely recommend that. In terms of other things that are sort of Key Marco specific, I might, let Patricia jump in if there's anything that she would recommend. But if we look a little bit more broader, one of the things that I would suggest doing is getting the book Hero, Hawk, and Open Hand, which is about the art of Eastern North America, native art of Eastern North America more broadly. And it has just it's probably the prettiest archaeological book I've ever seen. And it really delves into the details of some of the things that I've mentioned so far in this talk. So it talks about the Southeastern ceremonial complex and the various iconographic motifs that these objects utilize. And Key Marco is, of course, a big part of that. So I would highly recommend getting that book to learn about sort of the beautiful art of Eastern North America more broadly.
Meg, Austin's book actually will be released in September.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yep. And we're all
pre-order it on the Florida
We are
website.
anxiously awaiting it. So if you do order, it would be a pre-order. We of course will have it here at the Marco Island Historical Museum. And for those of you that are in the Naples Marco Island area, Austin will be doing a presentation on the book, and we'll be doing a book signing for him. So that'll be in the fall. Look for it in September, October.
And I would be happy, it's a much shorter piece, but I would be happy to send you, Patricia, if you would like to send it out to the participants, I can send you a PDF of the article that Austin and I just wrote together. That's in the Penn Museum's magazine called Expedition, which is generally for our members, but I know they would be happy if I shared that article more broadly with the folks that are interested in this site. And it'll cover a little of the ground we covered today, but it also delves into all sorts of other things. So I really hope, that Austin and I will continue to work together to get some more publications out. We've got lots of ideas But for now, I guess press pause for it for a moment, but just wait for Austin's book, because I think it's going to be really, really incredible.
Yeah, please do send the article, Meg, because I think people would really enjoy seeing it. I know how hard you and Austin have been working to develop it, and so yeah, please do that. That would
Yeah, I'll send it as soon as we're off, and then you're welcome to send it on to everyone.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Meg, I did also want to mention that some of the pieces that you shared with us through your presentation will actually be coming to the Marco Island Historical Museum. We are really excited to say that in June, we are expecting to receive, and this is the Historical Society and the museum in partnership, are expecting to receive 13 objects coming from the University of Pennsylvania. And then there will be an additional 3 that are, I won't say more important, but perhaps a bit better known. One of them being the deer head that we looked at, and they will be rotated over the next 3 years, but 13 of them will be here with us on display for 3 years. And they just so enhance the story that we are telling with all of these pieces. So we are very, very excited about that and just cannot wait.
Well, I can't wait to see them there. This is something that I didn't really talk about here because I was kind of focusing on teaching, but I think one of the things that was very exciting to me about coming to be a curator at the museum was the possibility of getting these objects to be visible to wider audiences, not just virtually, but there physically, and particularly to get them closer to their homes, their original homes. And so, I know I was really excited to see this request come through, and there's obviously, anytime you do an exchange with another museum, there's a lot of really difficult details, and I know you all have been patient with us too. But I thought, it was also maybe important to note that one of the reasons that we're rotating those 3 pieces, the kind of spectacular ones, is that those 3 were on display in our Native American Voices Gallery for a few years already. And because we have a conservation staff directly here at the museum, they're always keeping an eye on us to make sure that these incredibly fragile objects are not being sort of put on display for too long where light may damage them. So since they were recently on display here, that's why they're rotating down there. And hopefully, that still allows everyone to see them, and just means that all of you that are out there in the audience will have to go 3 different times to the museum to see them. But they really are exceptional. And then the other thing that I wanted to note with respect to the exhibit is some other things that we are sending on loan there are the various pieces that have been used by our museum a long time ago to cast some of the objects to basically create a small, like a replica of the object. And so the Key Marco cat in particular is an object that obviously captures people's imaginations. And we have the mold that was used to cast the Key Marco cats. And for me, it was really exciting that Austin wanted to borrow this for this particular exhibit, because no one is ever interested in those things at our museum. And to be able to sort of demonstrate the importance of us holding on to not just the object itself or records about the object, but the various things that have come into contact with that object at various times, things like this mold. I think that this is a great opportunity to emphasize that it's really important for museums to keep those types of materials as well, because it really does help to tell the story of this object that is no longer in our collections. It's now at the Smithsonian and visiting with you all. But we still have this interesting piece of its history in our collection. So it's really thrilling for me to get to send that down as well to a place where I know it will be more appreciated than it is here.
It will be very appreciated, that I can assure you. We do have a few other questions that are coming in, but we are running out of time. So what I thought I would do, Meg, if it's all right with you, is send those questions over, or perhaps you can if you can capture them on your end. And then Heather Otis, who, by the way, is our collections manager here at the Marco Island Historical Society, and really has been the person behind the scenes who has done all the coordination of our Zoom in programming, will be happy to send those responses out once we get them from you to everyone who's registered for today's program.
Yeah, absolutely. I can do that. Yeah, I just realized I didn't scroll down far enough to see those last questions. But yes, I'm happy to send out answers to any unanswered questions. And likewise, if anyone wants to reach out to me, I should be easy for you to find on the Penn Museum website. So feel free to reach out if you have further questions or if you want more information about anything. I'm always happy to hear from people. And I hope I can make it down to Florida soon to visit with you all in person.
Well, we hope so too. And I want to thank you for taking the time. We so appreciate everything that you've shared with us. And just a reminder to everyone who has joined us this afternoon, if you would like to learn more about the Marco Island Historical Society, the Marco Island Historical Museum, and our rich and treasured history, please go to our website. It's themihs.org and learn about the treasures that we hold in the public trust, because we are so very, very proud of them. And with that, I thank everyone for attending, and Meg, we hope to see you here on Marco Island soon.
I hope so too. Thank you all for coming. And yeah, hopefully I'll see you soon.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.